Hello, good morning. Welcome to the next lesson in the course on the Cold War, or relationship between the superpowers. We are now up to the early 1960s again, and this is one of the major incidents of the Cold War, which you should really quite get to know. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, comes between 61 and 62. Just introduce myself again. I'm Brian Dickinson, history teacher down in West Sussex, and I've been doing quite a few of these lessons now. My email address is on the PowerPoint, so if you want to stop and then email me any questions, any help, or I can mark your work if you do anything, or just ask questions, fine. Anyway, I'm just going to share my screen so I can show you the PowerPoint that we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the major hotspot of the Cold War. Okay, so the leader of America at the time, obviously you should know that, John F. Kennedy. Okay, the leader of Cuba at the time was a man called Fidel Castro. He died only recently, or a few years back. And the Russian leader at the time, you should know from the last episode or the last lesson we did, was Khrushchev, or Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, the background is quite important to get the background to how and why this started. Cuba is an island just 90 miles from Florida coast. Okay, it is really, really close. Some people have escaped there or from there on boats. Some people have swam it. Castro overthrows Batista in 1959. So in 1959, up until that time, there's a man called Batista, who was a leader of Cuba. He was seen as quite corrupt, very pro-American, allowed lots of American people to come over and invest. And it was a bit of a playground for the Americans, really. So it's just off the Florida coast. A lot of gangsters, a lot of mafia used to go there a lot. Business people used to open up, and it's a bit of a playground, bit of a nice place for Americans to go, very cheap. Once Fidel, but he was unpopular. Batista was unpopular, and Fidel Castro overthrew him in 1959 in a revolution. He ended at the end of US business on Cuba. Okay, he stopped it. He kicks all the American businesses out and nationalizes all the companies. So it takes it over. The government takes over the American businesses, which the Americans aren't very happy about. Obviously, they're quite a poor country. They rely on people buying their goods. For example, sugar is a main export of Cuba, and he requests aid from America. Obviously, they're going to reject that. So say, hang on, mate, you kicked all their businesses out. We're not going to help you. Also, because of this, Castro considers himself a bit of a communist, I suppose. This is supposed to be a revolution from below, which the Americans definitely don't like, especially on their doorstep, right next to their own country. They don't really like that at all. So America quite rightly, or not quite rightly, but understandably rejects it. The USA reduces the amount of sugar they buy from Cuba by 95%. So this really does have a trade embargo on Cuba, which until quite recently, I think it was Bill Clinton who actually was the first person to do something about that, and Obama stopped it only a few years back. So that embargo, not buying Cuban's goods, was really quite strict until quite recently. And so Cuba obviously are a bit worried because they are a small island. They're quite poor, still is, and they rely on selling sugar. And so they turn to the Soviet Union for help, and they send aid and agree to buy sugar as well. So the Soviet Union helped them out. So, oh, great. And I think the Soviet Union are looking upon this as a bit of a reason to get involved. This is an opportunity for them, really, to try and maybe upset the balance a little bit in that region, and maybe say Khrushchev thinks that Kennedy's a bit weak, he's a bit young, a bit inexperienced, and that sort of thing. Castro nationalizes all US businesses and property in Cuba. So it becomes almost like a communist state, really, in that respect. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union helped them, and why they turned to the Soviet Union for help. Okay. the American reaction to Castro's communism. Okay, see, they do see it as communism on their doorstep. The US unofficial policy to assassinate Castro. Now, this is not controversial saying this. This is actually true. They tried to assassinate him many, many times. They use methods like they try to poison him. They plant exploding cigars. Cuba is known for its cigars, Havana cigars, and he smoked a cigar, and they put explosives into it. TV studios were flooded with LSD, so people were going a bit mad. So they try to appear that he's mad. Everything fails. Okay, obviously, because Castro actually only died relatively quite soon, just a few years ago. He died just a few years back. But it's actually, this is not controversial to say that CIA tried to kill him. They did. It's quite common knowledge now. At the time it wasn't, but anyway, they tried to assassinate him. They didn't want him there. So what they did in 1961, in April, they decided to try to invade. And this is known as the Bay of Pigs. Now, the reason why it's called the Bay of Pigs is because there's an area on Cuba where the Americans tried to land. Now, the Americans, what they did, they didn't actually do it themselves. They didn't use American troops for this. There's lots of exiles, lots of people who left Cuba after the Revolution of '59 and went to stay in Florida. And if you go to Florida, there's still lots of Cubans there. They trained about 1,400 Cubans, exiles, to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. Now, Castro and the Cubans were expecting a full-scale US invasion. Okay, so they were expecting a really massive invasion, and they set up ready for this. Only 1,400 turn up, so they easily defeat them. They easily defeat the exiles, and so they're obviously worried, aren't they? The Cubans thinking, oh my God, the Americans are going to eventually invade. They're going to take over our country, kick everyone out. And Cubans were very much behind or most Cubans were behind Castro, and they didn't want an invasion by Americans. The Americans were quite unpopular, especially because they were associated with their former leader, Batista. So you can imagine that Cuba and Castro are a bit worried about another invasion. This is embarrassing for the Americans, actually. Even though they weren't directly involved in terms of sending troops, they were involved, and people knew that they had trained these exiles, so it was a bit of an embarrassment to them. Okay, so what the Americans then do is they fly some U-2, they're called U-2 spy planes over Cuba, take photographs, and they identify nuclear weapons on Cuba, or places that they can launch nuclear weapons on Cuba. Okay, now these are obviously Russian nuclear weapons, because Cuba is too small to have their own, they won't develop their own. So these are clearly Russian missiles that are on Cuba. And of course, this really does worry the Americans, because if you look at the how far Cuba is from America, therefore, you know, the short-range missiles could reach as far as Memphis and some parts of the, like almost in Washington, but long-range missiles could reach most of America, certainly Washington, New York, Boston, up to Salt Lake City. So they could reach a long way. So they don't want, you know, Americans do not want nuclear weapons on Cuba. It's just far too close. So this is a bit of a dilemma, really. What does Kennedy do? He could have a full-scale US invasion of Cuba. He could, but that would be seen as war. Don't forget there are Russian weapons on Cuba, which could be used against him. This could, and it's also right on their doorstep, isn't it? So this, you know, if he was to do that, that would start a full-scale war. He could blockade Cuba. Okay, he could stop any other troops or any other missiles, any other ships coming into Cuba. He could surgically strike missile bases, which is still an act of war, because then you're attacking Russian missiles. You're likely to kill quite a few Cubans there, and it's still, I mean, they're close enough to do that. Or he could just ignore it. Now, to ignore it would be seen as very weak. So he's caught between all-out war or nothing. Now, I don't know how much you have done all of this already. So the option he was to go for was the blockade. Okay, he decides to blockade Cuba. So they put an exclusion zone around Cuba. Okay, so any troops go in there, and he says on the 22nd of October 1962, Kennedy announced a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. They're the words of it. So any ships sailing towards Cuba from the Soviet Union would be stopped. Now, he said any Soviet vessels that did not stop, US ships had orders to open fire. So this is what's going to happen when those ships are heading towards Cuba with missiles on them. And do they turn back? Do they open fire? What's going to happen? Now, this came to be known as like when they were heading towards it, the world held its breath. What was going to happen? Because ships were heading towards Cuba, Soviet ships with missiles, and there was a naval blockade. And thought, what's going to happen? And it really is the day the world held its breath. What, is it going to be a war? Are they going to turn back? Now, behind the scenes, there was lots of these negotiations. There was lots of talk. Bobby Kennedy, who's John F. Kennedy's brother, was doing lots of meetings as well. And so 180 ships blockaded Cuba. 156 ICBMs, I don't know if you know what ICBMs mean, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were put on combat readiness, so ready to fire. Troops had been moved, usually United States troops moved to the south of the country, ready for war, basically. And so war did seem imminent. Now, fortunately, they turned back. Okay, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles if the USA agreed to lift the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. So that he turned them back. Okay, he actually made sure that they didn't go, but on the understanding that America would leave Cuba alone. Okay, and stop any blockade of other troops or other ships going to Cuba, so Cuba could live, basically, could survive. That was agreed, and that was agreed publicly. Okay, so he agreed to that in public. In private, this is where Bobby Kennedy came in. In private, and lots of people did not know about it at the time and did not know about it for some time, the USA agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. USA had missiles all around Europe, some of which were in Turkey. You think, why bother about Turkey? It's quite near Russia, or near enough to hit Russian cities. And so Russians were worried about that. And they said, look, if you remove your missiles from Turkey, we can agree on this. And that was done privately. That was not public. And that did not come out for some time. So as a result of that, then Khrushchev, in the papers, was give orders. It was seen as publicly giving orders for removal of missiles. Okay, Kennedy seems to have come out of this crisis much stronger. He had appeared to have won the war of words. The perception that Khrushchev had was that Khrushchev had backed down, especially as the deal over Turkey was not disclosed until much later. So publicly, it seemed as if Kennedy had won. And Kennedy had come out of this quite strong, and Khrushchev hadn't. Khrushchev was kind of praised for getting rid of the missiles, but also criticised in the communist world, especially from China, as backing down against a much younger and much more inexperienced leader in Kennedy. So it really was empirically, and the way it appears, a result for the Americans. This is a very famous cartoon at the time. You've seen this, I think, there's lots of times on exam papers. This comes out. This is what's called brinkmanship. Okay, you go to the brink. Who's going to blink first? Who's going to, especially on this blockade, who was going to actually? Khrushchev's on the left, Kennedy on the right. What are they sitting on? They're sitting on H bombs, hydrogen bombs. They've both got butters, which the butters they can press and blow the other one's nuclear weapon up. Who's going to blink first? Who's going to actually win on this? That's the idea behind this cartoon. And obviously, Khrushchev was seen as blinking first and didn't do it. You might come across this in your exams. This will certainly be in some of your textbooks that you've got in school, but this comes up a lot. So the impacts. Now, this is quite crucial, really, in terms of what you're going to do in your exams. You probably will not get questions about what happened, okay, in the exam. You may not get a telling a story, but you probably will get what were the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. A few years ago, I did a mock exam in my school, and we asked what are the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Loads of students, and I mean loads of students, wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about what happened, Bay of Pigs, about the blockade, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't about that. It's about the consequences. What came out afterwards? What came out as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis? So, a telephone hotline was set up in 1963. Okay? Both superpowers had realised how close they had come to nuclear war. So they set up this hotline, this telephone, basically, so they could communicate much quicker and much better. Seems obvious to have that now. Back in 62, 63, it wasn't so obvious. Now they've got one, and they've had one since. But they didn't want to, want to be able to pick the phone up to each other and say, look, hang on. Next, they were sending telegrams between each other. Okay, Kennedy appeared to have stood up to communism. Massive public opinion boost. He came out of this well. The Turkey missile deal remained secret. So he probably would not have come out of this quite so well if the Turkey missile deal had come out publicly. So they managed the publicity of that quite well, the Americans. Okay, so Kennedy came out of this quite good. A test ban treaty in 1963. There was a ban on testing nuclear weapons. Now that does not mean that there was a ban on making nuclear weapons, just testing them. Okay, so always be a bit cautious when you hear about reductions of nuclear weapons. A test ban treaty is only a ban on a treaty means an agreement, testing them. The Cold War never became as serious again. Despite future tensions, there was a major change in attitude. So this is the closest they had really come to war, and they both countries, both sides realised this, and they did not want this to happen again. Okay, Khrushchev came out of the crisis badly, criticised for trying to place missiles in Cuba and also for giving in to the USA. So the West saw him as being aggressive by putting nuclear weapons on Cuba, but also criticised him in the communist world for giving in to the USA. So he couldn't really win, and he kind of never really recovered from this. One of the few Soviet leaders who actually was taken over as leader didn't die, and then someone took over. He actually was taken over by a man called Brezhnev a bit later on in the 1960s. So we've got to think, was it fair? Khrushchev should be praised, or was it fair that he was criticised? Maybe. Okay, so in terms of a consequence, I suppose the major consequence of this was the fact that they realised they'd come to war, almost come to war, and they were determined this was not going to happen again, and they made sure that a hotline was set up, and it did change the way that they both saw each other. Okay, it did actually have quite a major change on this. As I said, I'm not going to do any exam questions on this one. There are exam questions on this, and it quite often comes up on your exam papers, but I will do another lesson on exams. Okay, hopefully pretty soon. I think the next lesson, which I'm doing later in the week, excuse me, is going to be on the Prague Spring in 1968, where another example of Russian interference in Czechoslovakia this time, and very similar to Hungary, but also very different, and it's quite often compared with Hungary as well. So that's the end of lesson on Cuban Missile Crisis. There's quite a bit on YouTube about this. There was a film with Kevin Costner called 13 Days, which was out in the cinema a few years back. I've not seen it personally, but I know it's pretty good. I've been told it's pretty good, and it goes through the Americans, how the Americans dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis from the president's point of view. I think Kevin Costner plays the president or someone close to him. Anyway, so you see all those talks about what they're going to do. So it's called 13 Days. It might be downloadable. I don't know. Have a look for it. But if you go on YouTube, there's lots and lots of little short videos about Cuban Missile Crisis as well. So that gives you a bit of a broad outlook. It's a very quick 20-minute lesson on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope see you again very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.